I've been working with a little company in Canberra called Cybersea, as in literacy, numeracy and cybersea. And basically, this company has realised that the issue is cultural, as I said in my talk, more than technical. And I thought I'd just sort of show, if you can think of a graph, here's the 0 point. This sort of level is the level of money that is being spent on technology to make our devices safe. This angle and the gap growing is what cyber criminals are taking from the internet and from scams of all sorts and malfeasant behaviour. So what we're really saying, and the key insight in Cybersea, is that the technology isn't working and isn't sufficient, and so we have to look at something else, and that something else is really our own conduct and our own behaviour. The second point I was going to make around passwords, a couple of people have asked me, how do you get a strong password? Well, you know, you get that little indicator sometimes saying strong, medium, weak. One of the and of course then the question is, how do I remember my password? One way, and it's only one way, is to think of a mnemonic. So the boy stood on the burning deck, for example, and then you might put a number or a exclamation mark or something somewhere along that line of letters to where you would remember. The other way to do it is then to repeat it. So in other words, do it once and do it twice. Two reasons. Firstly, about 14 characters is now a good number to aim for in a password. And secondly, what you're doing is trying to confuse any algorithm that is looking for alphabeticity. Those of you who remember all the World War II stories about the Enigma cipher and so on, always the cryptographers look for how many E's, if we're thinking English, I's, O's and U's. We know over long strings of text that there are going to be X number of E's and I's and O's and U's. If you're Dutch, there'll be lots of Y's and H's, and so it varies from language to language. Just look at different Scrabble sets for different countries to know that. But to the extent that you can start to make it look less alphabetical, the better. So just stop there, two little comments.
Hi, David McDonald from Naturalist Year 3A, and that may explain my problem that I faced yesterday at McDonald's. We went there for a bite to eat breakfast time. I stood waiting for someone to take my order. I was ignored. I kept standing there waiting. I was ignored, and I saw people coming in, and they were getting their food straight away, until my dear wife pointed out to me, you have to fill out a computer form. So my question to Brett and Steve is, are we in danger of being starved to death unless we go online?
I think this is more in Brett's court than mine, but I will make the observation that I have been struck, because I do work with my dad in getting him through the COVID certificates and the MyGov IDs at the age of 91. It is the barriers to entry for the non-technologically proficient, and even I'm technologically proficient, and it took me 2 hours to get a director ID for something the other day. Yeah. It is extraordinary, and I think what it points to, and this would be a Dewey didn't invent the decimal system, the Dewey Decimal System, but another Dewey did. But I think the secret is libraries. And I think I'd point to the importance of the local library and the way they're being reinvented as sites of cybery. Yeah. So if you 3As, I'm hoping you're meeting with libraries or have your local librarian invited or getting support from your local library, but I think they will be the forms of, they will be a pillar of rebirth. Yep. I hope, because it is impossible to function fully in this COVID environment and travel and so on without support of some kind. And I think about, it's not just the the relatively housed, it's the homeless I also think about.
Yeah. If you go to McDonald's, you won't starve, but you might get poisoned. But we all go to McDonald's because it's so damn convenient and easy. Or so many of us do. Perhaps not all, but so many of us do at some point. And look, what Stephen has said is right. It's just more and more and more is being demanded of us in the online world. That is not going to change. And we're going to see less and less people. In fact, an automated McDonald's store is not far away, where everything will be done by machines with no people. You'll simply place your order. You might place your order on your own device before you even leave home. You'll anticipate how long it will take you to get there, and you will simply, through some serving hatch, receive your meal. And that's how it'll be. And there won't be any people in the back. That'll all have been done by machines. Or delivered by drone if you don't want to pick it up.
Right, my turn. I think if I despair a bit about passwords. I don't know how other people feel about this, but I had a friend and he had something like 50 different passwords, and of course he had to write them all down in a book. And he was doing the right thing and changing them every month. And I mean, this becomes a complete nightmare now. I don't do that, but I do have about 20 different passwords for various things that I've been involved in over the years. And this can be the despair. You come along and they say, oh, where's your password? And truly, it's become...
I've got good news. I've got good news for you. Basically, and we're going to see more and more of this with machines giving us two-factor authentication. That's what it's called. And so on my phone, for example, I've got an app. In fact, I've got two, one from Google and one from Microsoft. And that basically gives me a number, and I can set up in my machine, in my accounts, I can, instead of having to remember the password, I simply log on to the app and it tells me what numbers to put in from time to time. So that's going to, some of you will already have this technology when you're going to do your banking, so you won't have to remember anything other than which app to use, and you'll have one or two on your phone. So it's going to get a lot easier for you, and you don't have to write it down.
And in principle, MyGovID is not, I think, a bad... I actually think from a technological point of view, it's a really important innovation and will bring down the hurdle once you can get on. And I think it's the barriers to getting set up and started, and also just designing the software with a view to actually making it work. You know, the mobile and the web-based interface, sometimes it works on one, sometimes it doesn't work on the other. So, but ultimately MyGovID is going to be an essential part of operating and verifying your identity.
Yeah, it's getting a bit simpler as well. So
that's right.
My question is, I've sort of got a filter. You know, I don't listen to Sky News and stuff like that because a lot of it's erroneous. You know, like I think what hasn't probably been mentioned is well, it has in a way, but journalism and the way media manipulates stuff, you know, like, but it's really hard to filter stuff, you know, like for me, you know, I'm not sure whether other people struggle with it, but you've got a certain way, you've got to interpret what's happening, you know, and another thing I don't think has been mentioned is trolls. But trolls influence other people that try to influence you, you know, and it gets a bit difficult at times, yeah?
I guess it's a really important topic, and I do spend a lot of time talking to students about it. I think there's, and the latest terms that they come up with, of course, are filter bubbles. That you know, the risk, I guess, is that you live in the, you know, just to play devil's advocate, I think the risk is you end up in the filter bubble. And you may not like Sky News, and that might not be your thing, but are you filtering out a range of points of view that are going on in culture, and that's how we get blindsided? I mean, I think so filtering, there's the filters you might put in place consciously around tags and so on, and we do this with kids in cyber safety, and the famous story that when you block the term breast, you also block sites to do with breast cancer. So that's the issue, but I also think there's the cultural filters we put in place, and unconsciously even. So filtering's a really interesting topic, and but there's also a part of it to do with your citizenship, and I kind of do expose myself to Sky News because I want to know what's going on in the other side of my political spectrum, even though it's mine.
Free speech is very important as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the best filter that we all have is this one, between this ear and the other one. And please just don't be frightened to use it. That's our internal bias. And, you know, Steve moderates his by looking at sometimes at news sites that he might not necessarily agree with. I do the same, because I need to know what my opponents are thinking. I'm an old intelligence officer, right? My job is to represent the enemy on my commander's staff. In fact, I went into a briefing one day to a 2-star officer and I said, listen, I'm the Cimmerian, and you better believe what I'm going to tell you, because the moon's blue, and when the moon's blue, I beat you in the Blue Force. And he said, that's crap. I said, no, I'm trying to tell you something here that I've got to think differently, because you've got to counter me. I've got to be the representative of the enemy on your staff, because you've got to think not like you think because you're comfortable with it, but rather you've got to, and you mightn't like the way I think, but boy, that's the way I think, and this is how I'm going to beat your ass.
That's going on in Ukraine at the moment.
Correct. The Ukrainians are out thinking the Russians, right?
Could I just use that question to shift the discussion in a direction that hasn't, which is, I think, the role of education and educational systems is really important in there as well. And I do think this danger that we just listen to what we want to listen to, and we just dwell in the perspectives that we like and block out everything else, that troubles me more than some of the extreme speech. Because I think that's where culture and communication go together. You kind of need to know where they hang out together. So if you find yourself in a habit of media and finding comfort in a certain kind of media, try something else. And it might not be to your taste or for a short time, but give it a go, because I think you need a balanced media diet, because the way the market's been driven, particularly, I talk to my students now about the way the West Australian now owns every community newspaper in Perth. Yeah. And the way this, it's not discussed in the West Australian, but I think it's a major issue for West Australian citizens that their news is delivered through primarily a 90% channel, and we don't talk about it. And so, I think that's really important.
I'd like to, I think there might be a slight difference in opinion over the question of gaming. My grandson was got to the age where he started doing some gaming, and I think as older people, I don't know about other people, but you tend to be a bit worried about it. You're worried about maybe the amount of time that's spent on gaming, and also perhaps the content. I actually was sitting with him and trying to sort of say, well, come and explain to me, tell me what's going on. I think I got killed in 15 seconds, I think it was. But I think it's I think we as an older generation perhaps worry about it, and yet I've heard mothers say, well, okay, these kids are going on, and they've actually got a community, they're talking to each other, it's become an online community for them. And the other argument is, well, if they're on there all the time and it is addictive, then they're not getting communication outside of it. Where's the communication outside, with the family and generally? I know my daughter she decided that she would they sat down and said, well, there's going to be limits and you can only play for so long, and they put up a timetable for it and everything else. And her son came back to her and said, well, okay, that's great, we've got the rules. She said, but you've got to have rules as well. And she said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, Friday night is movie and pizza time. You're not allowed to have Facebook. And she said, you know, she hadn't realised that she was on Facebook so much. So he actually came back to her. But is there, what is the role? It's for me, I don't quite know what the answer is. Is it good? Is it bad?
It's both. It's both. From my point of view, with respect to gaming, I worry more about the content than anything else. It's violent, invariably. The dopamine hit comes when you kill somebody. That's a pretty interesting message, isn't it? Be happy. You've just shot another person. And that is the bit that concerns me above all else with respect to gaming. Yes, communities are formed and people are playing with each other and collaborating and learning collaboration skills and using collaboration skills, big tick, globally. That's great. So again, it's the yin and the yang in that slide. And it's about how we evaluate risk and how we manage those risks within our families and our communities. I worry, let me just sort of take this a little further, as undersea cables went into Pacific Island communities, deeply Christian and matriarchal, those societies' social fabrics are being ripped apart because the men are now watching porn. Department of Foreign Affairs has put in place all sorts of programs to educate, to sort of try to counter this through social programs. Yes, we'll worry about the Chinese, but there's another, in my thinking, even more serious challenge to the efficacy of the societies in the South Pacific, and that is that they're being ripped apart by porn. And this is, again, not because, I'm going to say not because porn is bad or good, it's rather because the social fabric is not set up to deal with these sorts of disruptions.
And there's a bit of Dewey, you know?
Yep.
The societies, the communities being destroyed by the new technology. You know, it's been with us a long time, and I think there are a lot of overlaps between what Brett and I are saying. So I'm going to play out the differences for the spectacle part. For the spectacle part, I'll play out the differences more than the similarities. Shooter games, interesting, yes, but my son plays as a girl. That's really interesting to me. Yep. The circuit of culture is complex. And I think whatever the medium, whatever the media form, if the circuit of culture starts to feel toxic and narrow and not geared towards happiness and caring for others, shut it down. That goes for adults as well as kids.
That's right.
You know, so I think I think one of the things that I wanted to say is you mentioned ethics very powerfully in your talk, and I do too. We've been geared as a citizenry towards fear and morality around media. So I have colleagues who study games intensely and different kinds of games, and that's a big discussion. But I do think about this issue of morality in media and the idea that a screen is inherently negative. Well, if you have a mixed balance of experiences and you take your kids for walks and they've got a pet and so on, you know, that's how you balance that one out. So I think we've got this very highly triggered moral discussion around screens at the moment that sometimes just gets in the way of looking at what's actually happening. During COVID, those kids formed community on Discord.
Yeah.
Thank God they did, because they weren't able to go to camp. They weren't able to socialise in schools.
Yeah.
3/4 of my child's high school has been in masks. So good luck, you know, with his nascent emotional development and dating experiences and so on. It's going to be very interesting to see. So, yeah.
Hard to have your first kiss through a mask.
Hello, it's John Davey, And thank you so much to both of you. I really thoroughly enjoyed both your presentations. I've got a dilemma, and you may not be able to help me with the dilemma, but I do use Facebook because I've got two teenage granddaughters in Queensland, and that's the way I talk to them, and they occasionally send photographs of their social activities and so on, so it's just wonderful, you know.
Yep.
The other side of it for me is very, very dark.
Yep.
And that is, I think Zuckerberg is totally morally bankrupt, and but I can't answer the dilemma because I really take issue with him and what he's done to the media, and a lot of the time he's done it free. Can you comment about that, please?
Do you want to have a go?
Sure.
I'm going to squib that one.
Again, I think that can't be that controversial. I think it goes back to that slide where I said zeros and ones, and then it's a whole range of factors. And I think disaggregating our idea of what this circuit of culture is doing, what this media is doing, is important. If you just hang it on the evil intent of one person, then that's a very difficult dilemma to break down. What is true is that in America, Meta, the company, is facing anti-monopoly, monopolistic behaviour, antitrust lawsuits. It's being questioned in Senate around what it knows about Instagram and the way it harms or fosters young people's body images, and so on. So they're on the case. I mean, what is incredibly important, I think, is to there's a great podcast called Land of the Giants, if you want to have a listen. It's produced by public radio in the States, and it goes through Facebook's journey from the very early social connection all the way to earning WhatsApp. So Meta is the company that Facebook has become. Meta also owns WhatsApp. And WhatsApp is a totally different proposition. And in India, WhatsApp is operating as social media in a way that is very crucial to the infrastructure of the place. And, similar with Telegram and other, and they're the leaders of encryption. So these companies, as a media teacher, I say, you can't fixate on the boss. The Australian newspaper is not just the views of Rupert Murdoch. The Australian newspaper in Perth is one of the most highly unionised workplaces in Perth in the media. So you've just got to track the cultures. In the same way that the Russian military are not all evil geniuses, there will be disputes and internal arguments in these companies all the time. So there are people looking at this, but when Facebook turns off and sends the media dark because Australia wants to regulate, that's really interesting. Where your dilemma manifests itself really powerfully is Australia is at the moment dealing with a news media bargaining code. I don't know if you've heard about this in the news. It's basically a piece of policy that says unless they start giving back to the Australian media, Facebook and Google will be designated entities and they'll have to be regulated. So out of the fear of God, they've started paying Australian media companies.
That's right.
Unfortunately, they're giving it to 7 West, Channel 9. They're not giving it to the ABC, they're not giving it to startups, they're not giving it to regional papers. They're being very selective and non-transparent in the way that bargaining code works. So it's bad public policy. So it goes back to Brett's point. Government is not on the ball with this stuff. It's moving too fast. And it's not Zuckerberg's personal... it's not him as a persona alone is the dilemma. And it sounds like a great way to catch up with your kids.
But to the dilemma, it's essentially a binary choice, which is do you or don't you? And I think actually Stephen has given you an option, which is to think about not using Facebook in the future, but going to one of the other applications like WhatsApp. And as I was saying during the break, in COVID in my family, sister in New York, family in various places, we set up a WhatsApp link to Care for Each Other, and I know that some of you in this room have got WhatsApp groups in your streets and local areas for fire. So there are other ways of doing this that might help you to solve the dilemma by moving to a different platform, and that might help the moral piece about not liking Mark Zuckerberg and at the same time keeping you in touch with your family. So there are other options.
Hi. I've got a question as a relative newcomer. As a newcomer, I joined the film crew, and that was great. It gives me a chance to see lots of the different chapters or regions, as you call them. And it struck me a chord yesterday, something that the gentleman today perhaps can help us all with. Yesterday, Bill Bunbury was talking about the worlds apart. And he was talking about the worlds apart as to how the Aboriginal and the white Australian has evolved, shall we say, the relationship, and where we possibly are now. And he reflected a lot on what had happened in the past. And the shock for me, as probably one of the younger members, I'm 66, I'm new, I'm semi-retired, and I joined U3A to become informed, and I love the film crew. But what shocks me looking around the room is I see very few, if any, Aboriginal personnel. Maybe some of you are related to those lovely people. And I think that we need help to learn how we can communicate. Our U3A is, by the definition from Stephen Maris, a community. We have a common purpose. Our purpose is to learn with love and enjoyment. So why don't we now pursue to gain a much greater diversity, not perhaps just Aboriginal people bringing them in, but bringing in other people who live in Western Australia, in Perth and in the regions. But to do so, we probably need some information on how we can reach those people, how we can bring them in. It's all about communication these days. So please, I open this uncomfortable question that some of you may not be happy for me to say, but as a newcomer, I need to point it out, and I think it needs change. Please, gentlemen.
I'll have a go first. I'm aware of the same issue, and not just in this audience, but in so many audiences. 2 months ago, I was in Sydney, and one of the elders from the Wiradjuri people of the Eora Nation from Redfern gave welcome to country. And he was wonderful. Firstly, he said, "Geez, I'm among my tribe here. Look at you, you're all old and you've all got white hair." So that was a great laugh, and we all felt a sense of community and welcome. But right at the end he said, "Now look, there's something else that I want you all to know, which is we blackfellas, in times of death, we think about wills." And I'm thinking, where in the hell is this going? Anyway, he said, "Look, it's very simple. In your society and in ours, where there's wills, there's relatives." And of course, that brought the house down. Now, that was arms outstretched. I'm reading a book at the moment, just published a few months ago, essentially about First Nations people's understanding of the heavens and of astronomy. And in the context of communication, and in fact, Steve and I had a conversation about this just yesterday, is the question of songlines. How do you pass knowledge, picking up on, and I didn't expect that we were going to see Shannon and mathematics today, but hats off. I think that's fantastic that was brought up today by Steve. But I did not, how do you transition knowledge without language and writing in story and song that is passed from generation to generation for 60,000 years, and it's added to and accumulated to, and events that occur in the heavens hundreds of years apart are recalled and recorded. And how do you know, how do we guarantee that the knowledge of this generation passes truthfully to the next, to the next, to the next, being modified by these curious events that only happen centuries apart? Yet that's what these people have achieved. And that, of course, is to do with the way that, in particular, the men, with regard to the astronomical knowledge, were inducted into higher levels of understanding within their society. At least that's the way the book describes it, and I have no other option but to go by the book. Women, of course, had their own business and their own knowledge and their own understandings. And we can but marvel at that and admire it and love it and embrace it.
Thanks. I think the art of having the difficult conversation, I think it's a really good question, so I applaud you for raising it. I think as an organisation, it's like other organisations, we have to have, a lot of organisations are having these discussions. Yep. I'm not familiar with yours. It's happening all over, and it requires courage, it requires listening, it requires a bit of honesty and love. And I think that is a part of the communication puzzle that Shannon didn't talk about enough.
That's right.
And that's one of the reasons I raised the model, because we all know about signals and so on, but we're not great at thinking about how to bring care and love into our communication and communities. I think as a practical step, I'd look at your demographics and do some internal survey and start to see what your memberships actually look like. And from there, are there any patterns? And then from there, reach out to people who might help, your local Indigenous community groups and so on. The thing is, the university is an extraordinary thing, but I fear for it. I fear that knowledge is being carved up, commodified. Your kids have got burdens, debt burdens. Your grandkids and kids have probably got debt burdens from going to university or having an education, or have a burden from not going. So knowledge has suddenly become very commodified and political, and as a group of people who have the inclination and the curiosity to keep debating these things, I think that's great, because I think it's the chance to break some of the cycles we're in around the whiteness of groups, the lack of diversity of groups, and I'm working in my own groups around those issues. So I think and what's great is it's not like we don't have people not talking about healing around us. These are the latest social sciences week theme was healing. So it's not just a thing that Indigenous people need to do, white people need to do, it's across the board. Yeah. And I think that's where the ethics and the being a good human being part of a communal part of it, rescuing community from the white bus view of community and the governmental view and the welfare thing, and saying, no, we are a community. We can hear difficult things. And unfortunately, the sadness part of me says, I see families or groups that can't have difficult conversations. But there is help for that. And I'm sure that you can reach out, and I'm sure the universities around the place, their Indigenous centres would be a great place to start, and start making a point of not having two blokes talk on the same day. Preferably two blokes not of the same colour, and start hearing things from different points of view.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, well